Good morning, everyone. We are starting lesson 6 today of 1 Samuel 13 through 15. We have mostly seen Saul do pretty well so far. He has been a good king in the early stages at least, even if he was maybe overly hesitant to get into that role, down to the point of even hiding. But he has risen to the occasion. He has saved Jabesh-Gilead, and the people broadly support him. Well, chapters 13 through 15 kind of chart the decline of Saul, not so much in power. He's got power here, but the decline of his relationship with God, and as he is beginning to make choices that lead him away from his purpose that he has been given. So there's quite a bit to cover in this lesson. I don't know that we'll be able to cover it all in 1 week, but we will see how it goes. This starts off, I just want to highlight something for you and not necessarily attempt to come up with a definitive answer for it. But the beginning of chapter 13 says, Saul lived for 1 year and then became king. And when he had reigned for 2 years over Israel, and then it goes on to talk about what happened next. That is a notoriously difficult verse to, well, not even really to translate, but translation is fairly clear. What the translation means is really difficult to understand. Because literally it means Saul was 1 year old when he became king, and he reigned 2 years over Israel. Literally, that's not true, obviously. And so some of the translations take this to mean, well, it means 1 more year into his reign and these things happened. There are others who take this to mean that it's the formula for kings that we see all throughout. Samuel and Kings and Chronicles, the king reigned this many years, and then he died and this happened. But by Saul getting this incomplete, kind of garbled version of it, it's meant to symbolize the incomplete nature of his reign. I don't know. It's a little bit tricky to figure out and ultimately not super important for us. The only thing that this does mess with is it can get hard when you're trying to make a timeline and to determine exactly how many years Saul reigned. Depending on how you take a few different verses, you can come up with some different numbers. But the number of years he reigned is not as important as what happened in those years, and so we will mostly stick to that. I just wanted to highlight that for you in case you were familiar with it. So we see Saul continuing to do pretty well. He has these 3,000 soldiers that he has assembled. 2,000 of them are with Saul, and 1,000 of them are with Jonathan. Jonathan is not identified yet here, but we will find out that he is Saul's son. And I want you to be thinking about the comparisons between Saul and Jonathan throughout these chapters, because we have some interesting comparisons we can make between the two. But both of them are finding military success. They have support from the people. They are overall doing well. Jonathan defeats the garrison of the Philistines that was at Geba, and this becomes widely known. The Philistines have heard of it. Saul is announcing it. He blows a trumpet throughout all the land. He says, "Let the Hebrews hear." And all Israel heard it and said that Saul had defeated the garrison of the Philistines, and also that Israel had become a stench to the Philistines. This is verse 4. And Saul is given credit for this, not because he led the army himself. Jonathan did, but he is king, and what the people under him do, he gets credit for. That's kind of the way leadership works. You get the good credit and the bad credit for what the people under you do. And overall, this is a good thing. People are happy that there has been this level of success so far. So now we get to question number 3 about Saul making a sacrifice. And I'll skip ahead slightly just to show the sacrifice, and then I want you to answer why this has happened. He says in verse 9, so Saul said, "Bring the burnt offering here to me and the peace offerings," and he offered the burnt offering. Why did Saul make this sacrifice? Dave.
Basically, he got tired of waiting for Samson. And he just got tired of waiting. And so he was getting impatient and worried. So he ended up doing that, which we know later he got rebuked for that.
Right. So he was told by Samuel to wait.
Samuel, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, you got it. Told by Samuel to wait in Gilgal for the 7 days, and then he would come and Samuel would make this offering and kind of commission him to go and to fight against the Philistines. What is bringing the urgency? We've got something that's happened in between the victory and now Saul's very urgent need, okay?
Well, his soldiers were leaving him, so his forces were diminishing.
Yeah, why are his soldiers leaving him?
Because they're afraid.
Yeah. So what's happened in between is Jonathan has had this great success over the Philistines. They've defeated this garrison, and now the Philistines are angry. Steve.
Dumb, but was this where he wouldn't let them eat the honey?
Yeah, that's what we're getting to here in the next chapter. Saul makes some interesting choices in this for sure. But we see Jonathan's had this great success. Now the Philistines are very angry, and they've assembled a very large force to fight against Israel. And remember, the relationship at this point is that the Philistines have been the terror of Israel. They've been the ones controlling what happens, kind of demanding tribute from them, coming and raiding them when they feel like it. The Philistines are the stronger force here. And so in verse 5, we read that the Philistines mustered to fight with Israel. They've got 30,000 chariots, 6,000 horsemen, and troops like the sand on the seashore in multitude. And again, throughout all of this, you can take thousands literally or thousands to mean units. Either way, there's more thousands in the Philistines than there are thousands in Israel. And so this is a very big problem. Even though everyone was rejoicing and was happy, now we have a problem. And there are so many Philistine enemies that the people become very afraid. Saul's bleeding troops quite quickly. They're hiding in caves and holes and rocks and tombs and cisterns. Some Hebrews crossed the fords of Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead. Saul is still there at Gilgal, but he is losing support the longer this goes on. So I want you to put yourself in Saul's shoes. You're still a relatively new king. You've had success so far. You're told to wait 7 days for Samuel to come. But all the while, with every passing day, things are getting worse. With every passing day, you're losing soldiers. Every passing day, the Philistines are getting closer, and you can't see a way out of this. So the conclusion that Saul comes to is, well, forget Samuel. We got to get this show on the road. We got to get going, or there's not going to be any army to fight our enemies. And so he decides to make the sacrifice himself. And that was not what he was commanded to do. There were some times, and we will see later, David and Solomon both offer sacrifices to God and are praised for it. It wasn't so much that Saul was not allowed to offer any kind of sacrifice. This was not in the temple, going into a place where he wasn't supposed to go to, like some of the kings we see later. The big problem here is he'd already been commanded, wait 7 days, wait for Samuel to come. He will come and he will do this. And so he is not willing to wait, and he thinks that this has really just taken too long. But the irony of this is, when does Samuel show up?
Right after he made the sacrifice.
Yeah. So it's like as soon as Saul is done, well, there's Samuel. If you could have waited like an hour longer, then Samuel would have been there.
Well, what's interesting about this is that this is actually the first standing army for Israel. They did not have that before. And then Saul kept 2,000 for himself and 1,000 for Jonathan.
Yeah.
And what did Jonathan do with those 1,000? He attacked the Philistines.
Yeah.
And they heard about it.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, were they not conscious of the Philistines' massive army? I mean, you'd think they would have done some like spy work or something.
Yeah. I think what we see out of Jonathan in these chapters is he generally has more faith than Saul does that God's going to give them the victory. Jonathan's not too concerned about the numbers because he knows that Saul was commissioned by Samuel and therefore by God to be able to protect Israel in this military sense. The Philistines were supposed to be conquered by the Israelites. So Jonathan has every reason to believe that they're going to be successful. We'll see that develop in chapter 14 when Jonathan goes with just his armor bearer and goes and attacks a garrison with 2 people, which is an interesting move for sure. But the problem here is not necessarily that Jonathan was hasty in attacking. Like, this is what Saul's purpose was, and this was okay for them to do. The problem was in Saul not trusting that God was going to be with him and that he needed to do things God's way. And that wouldn't be totally clear just from this one event, but I think it is going to be developed more as these events come to pass. Steve?
In a way, I think this leads up to a tale later on when the Israel is split away and Jeroboam first is prevailing and worshiping in the Mizpah.
Yeah.
And he tells a prophet to go prophesy against him for holding worship there. And he delivers a message that each details are important. If you didn't catch the sons of at the start of Samuel 1.
Oh, yeah, sons of Eli.
Right.
Hophni and
If
Phinehas.
you didn't catch them with the horse. He comes back and is convinced by some guy that he's an angel and has that word from God, and he trusts that and the lines. This is like chapter 13 or something.
Yeah. The details are important, and God expects to be obeyed. Saul may be king, but God is God. And so even Saul needs to obey him, and that's what he's not doing here. In this particular event, like, this is the one that is probably the easiest for us to sympathize with Saul. He's caught in a tough position. He even made an attempt to wait. Samuel is a little bit late. He maybe needs to assume, but Samuel's not going to show up. Like, out of the things that happen in chapters 13, 14, 15, in chapter 13, like, Saul is the most forgivable. His actions are the most forgivable. That's not excusing what he has done. The point being is his rebellion is going to escalate as time goes on. And what he first does with maybe some reason behind it and some attempt to follow quickly devolves into a more outright rebellion against God. So Samuel is not happy with Saul. He says, "What have you done?" Saul answers, "When I saw that the people were scattering from me, and you did not come within the days appointed, and that the Philistines had mustered at Michmash, I said, now the Philistines will come down against me at Gilgal, and I have not sought the favor of the Lord. So I forced myself and offered the burnt offering." That is some interesting wording there. So I forced myself. Talk to me about that. What do you think about Saul's rationale here? Dave?
Well, Samuel
Yeah.
was a priest.
Yeah.
Only a priest could do that said before.
Yeah.
And apparently, was it like an hour later that
Yeah.
Samuel shows up?
It says right after.
So,
Yeah.
it just seems that he was extremely impatient
Yeah.
and worried, rightfully so, because he preemptively caused a war
Yeah.
without adequate forces and didn't consult God first off, that we can read about anyways.
Yeah.
So it was just odd to me that he just went ahead, well, I'll go ahead and do it. Well, that's sinful. You can't
Right.
do that.
Yeah.
So,
He gives fear as his reason, though I, like you, wonder if there's some pride involved here of, well, I'm king. If anybody can do it, I can. I'm in charge of everybody here. I'm in charge of Samuel, too, and maybe a little bit of unsaid, I'm in charge of God, though it's certainly not true, that he believes that he just has to do this. Scott?
Yeah, just he's justifying this sin,
Yeah.
he's saying, well, really had no choice. I mean,
Yeah.
what are we gonna do? And, I took it in my own hands against my own better judgment, because I do know this is wrong.
Yeah.
I think in that he's admitting,
Yeah.
I fully understood this wasn't right, but, it needed to be done, and, how could you really blame me?
Yeah.
And we do that sometimes with sin in our lives. We can try to justify things and say, well, such and such made me put me in the situation and just kind of forced my hand.
Yeah.
So, I went against better judgment and did that. Well, it doesn't work out for Saul. We should try to figure out that's not going to work out for us either.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I have heard that statement so many times from, many people really, and probably have said it myself that, well, I had to. I had no choice but to do this, and very rarely is that ever true. We think we have no other options, when in reality we just do not like the option that is the real alternative to this. Saul absolutely had an option. He had the choice to continue to wait on Samuel, to pray to God that his people would not leave too quickly, to try to command them to stay put, to continue to show trust in God. It was not going to be easy. I'm not saying that it would be easy to watch your troops scattering because the Philistines are getting closer, but it is an option. He still has the choice to obey God.
We see that Saul doesn't have the faith in God. He's got more trust in himself
Yeah.
and in the people than he does in God. Because the people are leaving. And he's like, well, if more people leave, I'm not going to be able to defeat this army. He wasn't thinking about God being with him. So as Gideon was, Gideon was outnumbered against the Midianites, I think it was.
Yeah.
4-1 at the beginning, and then God whittled them down, to 10-1, and then it was all the way down to 300 men going up against the multitude. So Saul, like I said, Gideon trusted in God for the victory, but Saul was thinking, hey, if I keep losing to these people, I'm not going to be able to defeat these people.
Yeah.
It wasn't faith in God.
Right. Absolutely. He's thinking much more about himself, much more of a trust in his own ability to lead, which, on one hand, it's, I guess, good to see Saul get some of that confidence that he didn't have at the beginning, but that confidence has turned in a bad way. It has now become pride and self-sufficiency, which is not the right lesson to learn here. Dave?
Yeah, something to remember that sometimes confidence can cause us to do things we should not do.
Oh, yeah.
Because, Samuel said, "What have you done?" And he goes, "Well, it's your fault.
Yeah.
You weren't here when you said you're going to be."
Mm-hmm.
He shifted that blame right back on Samuel.
Yeah.
Which is ridiculous. And the real problem was the blame was on Saul for not inquiring of God or someone or anyone or anything about waiting
Yeah.
for a priest to do that offering.
Yeah, there's a disturbing lack of any mention of Saul inquiring of God, asking anything of God, any kind of spirit language that, like we saw when he saved Jabesh Gilead, that he was filled with the Spirit. But nothing of that here. In all of chapter 13 and even 14 and 15, Saul does what he does, but seemingly without the involvement of God. He's just not real concerned with what God wants him to do. Even though he's making a little bit of an effort, he did try to wait for Samuel, but as soon as it was longer than he was willing to wait, well, then we're off to the races. Scott?
Oh, I did raise my hand, but I'll.
No, sorry.
All that was making me think of how God provides a way of escape from our temptations.
Yeah.
Not always liking the way that He might provide, which sometimes is turn and run, or stop doing what you're about to do, or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
You can really see that in this, that, it was like minutes in hindsight, and I think God always works that way. He gives us, well, I know He does. I trust in that because He says, I'm going to give you a way to fight temptation.
Yeah.
There is a way out. You may not understand it. You may not like it. It may not be on the timing that you think and all the stuff. It's act of faith and trust. What's been being said, It's
Yeah.
totally it.
Absolutely. Steve?
This is bigger than Saul and what I'm saying is subversive or crying up. In 2 Samuel 7:16, and Samuel's at Jesse's place. And for the purposes of anointing God's choice as the king, even though he was also back in 1 Samuel 8 when Samuel was conversing with God. God tells him, they're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me. So Samuel's there and he admits, I don't know who wrote 2 Samuel, but he admits that he thinks Eliab surely is anointed. And God tells him that he doesn't look at
Yeah.
when leader.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's going to be what develops here, the rejection of Saul and the seeking for someone who's going to follow God differently than Saul did, better than Saul did, will become very important. Ida?
This is going back a couple of weeks, but I think it's important for us to remember that Saul had, at one point, people were asking, is he among the prophets?
Yeah.
And so this shows you that just because you have a miraculous outpouring of the Holy Spirit
Yeah.
or any other measure of the Holy Spirit, you still can be stupid.
Yeah. Hey, it's true. And there's something about that question people are asking of, is Saul among the prophets? Like, it first is in this incredulous way of, Saul was never a prophet before and now he is prophesying. What a wonderful sign of God's approval of this man. But we're told there that became a saying, that was something that continued to be said for a long time afterwards. And I can't help but think that had to take a turn in meaning eventually. That it becomes more sarcastic, that as Saul is clearly not following God, is Saul among the prophets? No. Not anymore, he's not. He's making these very foolish decisions. He's no longer following God. He is not filled with the Spirit here. He is not seeking after God. And now we're going to see what Samuel tells Saul about God's judgment of this matter. So what is it that Samuel says is going to happen? Gary?
You just lost your kingdom.
Yeah, you just lost your kingdom. He says, the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. That this would have continued in your line. But now your kingdom shall not continue. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart, and the Lord has commanded him to be prince over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you. So Saul had this opportunity to be the man after God's own heart. He had the opportunity, and We don't need to be, like fatalists about this, that Saul never had a chance. It's funny, you read some of the commentators about Saul and they say, well, he's a victim of his circumstances. He's a victim of the things that are happening to him, and he never really had a chance. No, he absolutely had a chance. It is not easy to be king. He has serious responsibilities. He is up against things that, honestly, I do not envy. I don't want to be in Saul's position of having the mighty Philistine army coming with troops like sand on the seashore, and my troops are scattering in every direction around me. I don't want to be in that situation because that sounds incredibly difficult and incredibly trying. But this is what God called Saul to do. And he told him from the get-go, if you will believe in me, if you will have faith and trust and obey, then I will always be with you. It's Saul's fault that he didn't do that. So he's not a victim of his circumstances. He's a victim of his own choices.
We used to have leaders that just put the cart in front of the horse. I'm sorry, that was wrong.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah.
yeah, he tells them, you obey first, so you don't have to sacrifice.
Right. Yep. Absolutely. Now, beginning like in verse 19, we see some of the extent of the problems in Israel and how much the Philistines have been able to control them. Might not have understood this fully before this point. If you're just reading this, you might think this is just a war between two nations. But the Philistines definitely have the upper hand, because verse 19 says, now there was no blacksmith to be found throughout all the land of Israel. For the Philistines said, lest the Hebrews make themselves swords or spears. But every one of the Israelites went down to the Philistines to sharpen his plowshare, his mattock, his axe, or his sickle. And the charge was 2/3 of a shekel for the plowshares and for the mattocks, and 1/3 of a shekel for sharpening the axes and for setting the goads. So on the day of the battle, there was neither sword nor spear found in the hand of any of the people with Saul and Jonathan, but Saul and Jonathan his son had them. So the level of control that the Philistines have over them, they've been able to make sure there are no blacksmiths in all of the land. Whether they have killed all the blacksmiths, captured them, removed their tools, I don't know exactly what they have done, but they have ensured that the Israelites are not even able to construct weapons. And this is a serious problem. And so to sharpen even their farming implements, now they need to go to Philistia and to have them do it for them and paying a hefty charge for the privilege. But this is just one more level of the difficulty that they're facing. Not only are they outnumbered, but Saul and Jonathan are the only ones with real weapons. They're the only ones who have metal weapons. Surely the other soldiers, had things made out of wood or stone or other materials that you would need a blacksmith for, but you don't really want to be using outdated, less effective weapons in a war, particularly when you're already outnumbered. This is tricky. This is not going to go well, at least that's what is in the minds of many of the people. So that's contributing to the fear of Saul and the fear of the people that they're scattering as the Philistines are approaching. But a battle is brewing. They will come to clash against each other soon, and we'll see what happens. Anything else through the end of chapter 13 that you want to bring up? Yes, Sue.
I just thought it was interesting when Samuel tells Saul that the kingdom would be taken away from him based on the actions of Jonathan following this, how it appeared he had great faith in God, and yet the kingdom would be taken away from Saul, because you would think Jonathan would, become the next king. So I just thought that was interesting.
I think it's interesting too, because the account is much more positive regarding Jonathan than it is Saul. Saul has this decline and this lack of faith in God. We don't really see that out of Jonathan. Jonathan, we see, trusts that God is going to deliver the victory and that God is going to be with Israel and to be with him. And even when this gets passed on to David, Jonathan is supportive of David because he knows that this is God's will. Now, what level of character do you have to willingly not contest the throne because you know it's God's will for this to go to someone else? Like, do you think Jonathan could have found supporters? I think he could have, seen how popular he was in some of these chapters. There could have been quite a civil war between Jonathan and David. And if God is with David, David is eventually going to win, but Jonathan could have gone down swinging. He makes no attempt to do any of that because he knows that this is God's will. He's Benjamin, yes. Yeah, Mark.
I find it interesting when Samuel's telling him his kingdom's being taken away and God has sought out somebody who's looking for his heart. And I think about when he chose Saul. Saul was looking for God's heart as well. He was trying to be that guy.
Mm-hmm.
But once he had some power, that kind of got lost on him.
Yeah.
He proved himself in the beginning. And I think that's a good application for any of us as Christians or anybody. That God doesn't choose us so that we can become great. God is the one who's great, and we're to stay in that position of humility.
Yeah.
In anything of ourselves.
And sadly, it's power and wealth and influence and all of these things of this life that so often are the greatest temptations in pulling us away from God. That it can be easier to rely on God when, well, we don't have any power to speak of or any money to speak of or any real influence to speak of. But when you feel powerful, when you feel like you are effective and useful and able to carve out your own destiny, and you have people who listen to you, well, it can be hard to submit to God and to remember that He is the one who's still in charge. And so it's quite a swing for Saul to go from so fearful that he's hiding in the baggage to now so proud that he's not seeking God. The years of his reign have not been good to him, and you would think that this would only improve his ability to serve God, but it really doesn't work out that way. Dave?
Yeah, the interesting thing is part of the king's duty was to lead the nation spiritually.
Right.
I'm suspicious, and I think rightfully so, that there's probably buyer's remorse at having Saul, because we want a king, right? They got one, and they got what they paid for.
Yeah.
And the thing about that whole thing is that something like 20 years he was in reign after this, so they had to deal with this king who obviously wasn't seeking God, as like he should have. And I don't know about all the time, but I don't think so, because he got replaced.
Yeah.
So it's just something to consider when, for us.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thinking about leaders.
This is what we said before of Israel got the king that they deserved. And they were pretty wicked. They were rejecting God, and they got a king who absolutely had the opportunity to lead them better. But in practice, what happened was Saul contributes to the decline of Israel. Saul contributes to the lack of faith in God, and he does not fulfill his mission as God has given it to him. The mission to bring military victory over the Philistines and over these other peoples. Like, there are some victories, but if Saul had obeyed and if Saul had done what he was supposed to do, then Philistia should have been stomped out. Like, there shouldn't have been any more Philistines after this. But there were, and they continued to stick around for many years to come. Scott?
You know, along with what Dave's saying, that this brings back to, you know, God's plan was for the king to come from Judah.
Mm-hmm.
We see that from Deuteronomy. His scepter will be Judah.
Yeah.
And this is accomplishing what God set out to do in a way.
Yeah.
To show you, or to make the nation crave the right king, the better king. And David is the partial fulfillment of that. Of course, Jesus is the ultimate fulfillment of that. But you can see that it's not like God's surprised.
Right,
He goes,
yeah.
oh man, I really was hoping on Saul. You know,
Yeah.
I think it was like, yeah, this is where it is. You know, this is where it was going to lead you.
Yeah.
Whether Saul was going to be the one or someone after him.
Yeah.
This is the wrong way to go about it. It all comes down to, you know, like Dave said, we've got to think about our motive for serving. It's always got to be, you know, spiritually minded and after what God wants. And, you know, it just really shows, it's a story of the way God wants our faith in our heart.
Yeah.
And you don't go that way, you wind up with like Zimri and burn down the place
Yeah.
around him, or Jehu that they sent Elijah sent somebody else in his place and,
Yeah.
and duck and run as soon as you could annoy him, and some others. I mean, just like coming out of the suitcase. Yeah, it doesn't look like a.
Yeah. This is, you know, all the trouble that Israel is dealing with is because of their lack of faith, because they will not obey. And when you have bad leadership, especially, that effect is magnified. The more of a position of power and influence someone is in, the more that they, can affect for good or for ill in their community, their nation, whatever the case may be. And Saul has effect over the whole nation of Israel, and he has rejected God. And there are going to be consequences because of this. Okay, so in chapter 14, which we'll start just a little bit of this, Saul, we see, has replaced Samuel with Ahijah, who is a priest of the Lord. Unsurprisingly, Saul isn't all that interested in having Samuel around him anymore. If Samuel says that he has been rejected by God, then Samuel's not his favorite guy. So if Saul's going to continue to try to call upon the Lord, he needs somebody to do this, and he gets this priest who's able to do it. But Ahijah in verse 3, and we will go back to what's in verse 1 as well, but I wanted to highlight this first. In verse 3, this Ahijah is the son of Ahitub, Ichabod's brother, son of Phinehas, son of Eli, the priest of the Lord in Shiloh, wearing an ephod. Now, you've seen enough genealogies in the Bible to know that they pick some number of generations, for suiting the purpose of the story, of the record, and they go down those generations. What's different and unusual about this mini genealogy? It doesn't go just straight down, right? What's the little detour we take in it?
Brother.
There's a brother mentioned. That's not a very common thing to do in genealogies, to not in the Bible, to take this little, sideways detour of highlighting a brother and then coming back down. So there's a reason for this. If you remember Ichabod, in chapter 4, verses 21 and 22, we have Ichabod. Let me head over there for a minute. So Ichabod is the son of Phinehas and the wife of Phinehas, who is not named in here, but when Hophni and Phinehas die, and Eli also dies, starting in verse 19, you might remember this. Now his daughter-in-law, the wife of Phinehas, was pregnant, about to give birth, and when she heard the news that the ark of God was captured, and that her father-in-law and her husband were dead, she bowed and gave birth, for her pains came upon her. And about the time of her death, the women attending her said, "Do not be afraid, for you have borne a son." But she did not answer or pay attention. And she named the child Ichabod, saying, "The glory has departed from Israel," because the ark of God had been captured, and because of her father-in-law and her husband. And she said, "The glory is departed from Israel, for the ark of God has been captured." The name Ichabod means glory departed. And so the effect of highlighting this brother, Ahijah is not a son of Ichabod. Ichabod is his uncle. But we're highlighting Ichabod here because the author wants you to remember what Ichabod's name means. Glory departed. Why is that relevant here? When Ichabod was named that was referring to the Ark of God being captured. Well, the Ark of God has been recovered and is now safe. So why do we care about glory departed?
Priest was not God's choice.
Yeah, this is once again God's glory departed from Israel as a result of Saul's actions, and this should be Samuel here, not Ahijah. And even more than that, even more important than that, is Saul should have been listening to God. Saul should have been obeying God, and he was not. And so there will be consequences to that. And even in something as simple as a genealogy, in highlighting a brother in such a strange way, highlighting the uncle, which is not a thing we see. You go through a bunch of genealogies, you'll see it's, and his father was this, and his grandfather was this, or the other way, there was a man, and his son, and his son, and his son. It doesn't go to brother very often. You can't go too far out to the side, or you'll be there forever, right? You can just infinitely go out to the sides in the family tree. But here we've got to highlight this uncle because the name is important. The meaning of his name is important and is a reflection of what is happening in Israel now. So Jonathan and his armor bearer secretly cross over to the Philistine garrison. And here is kind of where we come face to face with the questions that we've been asking. Was Jonathan being hasty before when he went and attacked? Was he jumping the gun and causing problems by attacking the Philistines? Here, Jonathan seems to be doing the same thing. He's crossing over to go attack the Philistines, but he's being even more reckless, it seems. He's going with just his armor bearers, 2 of them. And he says to his armor bearer, when they see us, if they say, "Wait there and we'll come to you," then we'll know that we aren't supposed to be doing this and that God's not with us. But if they say, "Come up here to us," then we'll know that God is with us and that he'll give us the victory. And they say, "Come up here to us." And so they start fighting, and the 2 of them, very quickly kill 20 men. And Jonathan's statement shows that it's not a matter of hastiness and impetuous behavior from him, that this is faith. He says, "Nothing can hinder the Lord from saving by many or by few." God can save with however many people he feels like. And this is the lesson of Gideon, right? As was mentioned earlier, that Gideon was able to deliver the people from the Midianites with just 300 men. God whittled them down. Clearly, Jonathan understands this principle. It doesn't matter how many people there are. If God will give them the victory, God will give them the victory. And he is is willing to do this, and God clearly approves because he does give him victory here. The Philistines are greatly afraid, and verse 15, we're told, literally, it became a panic from God, or it became a trembling from God there in the Philistine garrison. Okay, next week, Lord willing, we will continue on in chapter 14 about Saul's response to seeing the chaos in the garrison, all these events in chapter 14 with the fighting and the rash vow and all these things there, and hopefully chapter 15 as well of Saul against Amalek. Thank you all.